All right, so think about this for a second. You hit a key on your keyboard, and boom, a letter pops up on your screen. Or like the wind starts blowing, and suddenly all the leaves are, like doing a little dance. And hey, has this ever happened to you? The phone rings, and your entire train of thought just vanishes.
Yeah, totally get that. Happens to me all the time.
Right. It seems so simple, right? Cause and effect 101. But when you really think about it, like really dig down, what even is that connection? What makes something a cause and something else the effect?
It's these deceptively straightforward questions, these seemingly basic observations about everyday causality that can actually lead us down some pretty deep rabbit holes philosophically.
Totally. It's like the more you think about it, the less clear it all becomes.
Exactly. And then, throw in the whole concept of the divine, like where does God fit into all this cause and effect business? How does that work?
Oh yeah, that adds a whole other layer of complexity, doesn't it? Suddenly things get a lot more tangled.
For sure. And it's from this kind of fertile ground, this intersection of divine action and natural causality, that a view called occasionalism emerged.
Occasionally, okay.
Uh,
From what I understand, it's this idea that God is actually the only true cause. Like everything that happens, it's all God.
Right, you got it. And one of the most prominent proponents of this view, Nicholas Malebranche, put it this way: there is only one true cause because there is only one true God.
Yeah.
All natural causes are not true causes, but only occasional causes.
Whoa, okay. That's pretty radical, right? I mean, it kind of throws everything we think we know about cause and effect out the window.
Yeah, it's definitely a perspective that can, shake things up a bit, especially when you first encounter it.
So in this deep dive, I think it would be really valuable for our listeners, especially those who are already interested in philosophy, to really unpack this idea of occasionalism, to understand what it actually claims, how it developed historically, and what kind of arguments have been made in its favor.
Couldn't agree more. It's a view that might initially seem a bit strange, maybe even a bit unsettling, but ultimately, I think it offers some really surprising and intellectually stimulating insights into the very nature of causality.
Yeah, I'm definitely intrigued to see where this goes. So let's start with the basics. What are the core tenets, the fundamental claims of occasionalism? What are we really dealing with here?
Okay, so at its heart, occasionalism rests on two fundamental
Mm.
propositions. The first is the positive thesis. God is the only genuine cause of every single event that happens. Period.
Okay, so it's all God all the time, no exceptions.
Well, that's the full-blown, no-holds-barred version.
Right.
But then you got the negative thesis. No creaturely cause, like a person or a physical object or any natural force, has any genuine causal power.
So even when it seems like something else is causing something, it's really all God behind the scenes.
That's the basic idea. They might be what are called occasional causes. We'll dig into that concept a bit later, but yeah, that's the gist.
Okay, so it's a complete reshuffling of causal power. Everything ultimately comes from God.
Right. But, it's important to point out that not every philosopher who's been labeled an occasionalist went all the way with this, like Malebranche did. Some adopted a more, you could say, localized view.
Localized, huh? What does that mean?
Well, think of it this way. You can have occasionalism for domain X, right?
Yeah.
Meaning within that specific domain, God is the only genuine cause, and everything else is just like an occasion for God to act.
So, could you give an example of a domain where someone might be like a local occasionalist?
Sure. Think about the way physical objects seem to interact, like billiard balls. One ball hits another and makes it move. A local occasionalist might say that the first ball isn't actually causing the second ball to move.
Okay.
Instead, it's God who's directly causing the motion of the second ball, using the first ball's collision as the occasion to do so.
Got it.
But this same philosopher might still allow for genuine causal efficacy in other domains, like maybe mental causation, where thoughts cause actions, or biological processes, like growth and development.
So global occasionalism means God is the only cause everywhere, all the time, and local means it's just for certain areas.
Exactly. With global occasionalism, like Malebranche, you've got a complete denial of creaturely power across the board. Everything a creature seems to do is really God acting on the occasion of that creature's. Well, whatever it's doing.
Right.
With local occasionalism, it's more restricted. But no matter which type we're talking about, what occasionalism really pushes us to do is to look more critically at these so-called causal interactions, to question, like, what's a real cause and what's just an occasion.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this view could really make you rethink some pretty fundamental stuff.
Oh, for sure. It definitely challenges our everyday intuitions about how the world works.
Totally. Now let's talk about the history of this idea, Where did it come from? Who were the big players? How did it evolve over time?
Well, even though the term occasional cause is often attributed to a French philosopher named Louis de la Forge, the earliest explicit versions of occasionalism actually popped up in Islamic philosophy.
Really? So this isn't just a Western idea.
Nope, not at all. Specifically, it emerged within the Asharite school of Kalam, which is a tradition of Islamic doctrinal theology. This was back in the 10th and 11th centuries when they were trying to, reconcile their theological framework with concepts from Aristotle and Neoplatonism.
So it's got a pretty diverse intellectual history, which is interesting. Yeah. But who are the key thinkers in this early Islamic development of occasionalism? Who should we be paying attention to?
So al-Ash'ari, the founder of the Asharite school, was a big influence for sure. He kind of set the stage. But the real star of the show, in terms of articulating the arguments for occasionalism, was al-Ghazali.
Okay,
Yeah. He was a super influential philosopher and theologian within this tradition. And his most famous work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, it's got some heavy-hitting arguments that a lot of people see as pointing towards a pretty comprehensive, even global form of occasionalism.
The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Yeah.
Sounds intense. Who was al-Ghazali going up against? What was he pushing back on?
Well, he was taking on some pretty big names in Islamic philosophy, especially guys like Avicenna, who were more in the Aristotelian camp. Al-Ghazali really didn't like Avicenna's idea that there were these causally necessitating relations between creaturely causes and their effects.
Causally necessitating? That sounds like a mouthful. What does that even mean?
Basically, Avicenna thought that given the nature of a creaturely cause, its effect had to follow. It was inevitable. There was no other way it could go.
Okay.
And Al-Ghazali saw this as potentially a big problem for the possibility of miracles. I mean, if creatures have this inherent power to necessitate their effects, wouldn't that limit God's freedom to act differently?
Right. If a creature is forcing something to happen, it seems like God can't step in and do something different.
Exactly. And for Al-Ghazali, this idea of creaturely necessity really clashed with the absolute power and omnipotence of God, which, was a cornerstone of Asharite theology. He argued that any natural relation that could, resist or constrain God's causal power was a no-go, theologically speaking.
So for al-Ghazali, the only genuine causal necessity is divine necessity.
You got it. And this ties into another interesting point al-Ghazali made. He believed that any two things, if they're really distinct, they exist separately. The existence or non-existence of one doesn't automatically imply the existence or non-existence of the other.
So just because we see one event followed by another doesn't mean they're logically linked. One doesn't require the other.
You got it. Now, this brings up a big question that scholars have been debating for ages. Was al-Ghazali really a full-blown global occasionalist like Malebranche?
I see.
Some people say yes, definitely, because he emphasized God's singular power and denied these logically necessary connections between creatures. Others say, well, maybe he was just trying to defend the idea of miracles. Maybe he still thought creatures could have some genuine causal power, even if it wasn't absolutely necessary.
So it's still up in the air.
Kind of, yeah. The real crux of the matter is whether al-Ghazali thought that for something to be a genuine cause, it had to necessitate its effect.
Right.
Because if he thought that, and if he only gave that kind of necessitating power to God, well, then that would mean he was denying genuine causal power to creatures.
Right. Makes sense.
But if he allowed for a kind of causation that doesn't involve logical necessity, then creatures might still be real causes in some, maybe weaker sense.
Okay, so even in these early Islamic discussions of occasionalism, there were already different interpretations and nuances to the idea. That's fascinating.
Absolutely. And those complexities continue as we track this idea moving into medieval Christian Europe.
So who picks up the torch there? Who are the big names we should know about?
One figure who really stands out is Nicholas of Autrecourt. He's a 14th century philosopher, a sharp critic of the scholastic tradition that was dominant at the time. And he directly challenged this idea of necessary connections between creaturely powers and their effects.
Interesting.
And there's actually evidence that he might have been familiar with al-Ghazali's arguments.
Wow, so similar ideas popping up in totally different contexts. That's amazing.
Right, it's like these parallel intellectual developments happening across cultures and time periods. It's really cool when you think about it.
Totally agree. But you said that it's not completely clear if Autrechort was a true occasionalist.
Yeah, that's the thing. Autrecourt's whole philosophical project seems to have been more about skepticism.
Hmm.
Like, he was trying to show that our judgments about the world, including our ideas about cause and effect, aren't as certain as we think they are. He was all about suspending judgment, not jumping to conclusions. And while his arguments share some similarities with occasionalism, his overall stance is more like questioning the very possibility of causal knowledge. He's not saying creatures definitely aren't causes, but he's saying we can't be sure they are.
Ha, I see. So he's more about poking holes in our assumptions than providing a definitive alternative.
Exactly. Some scholars even call him like a 14th century Hume because of his focus on the limitations of our knowledge of causal relations.
Interesting. So Autrechort kind of set the stage by challenging the idea of necessary connections, but it wasn't until later that occasionalism really took off in the West.
Right, and that's where Descartes and his followers come in.
Ugh, Descartes. With his famous mind-body dualism, it seems like that idea would almost inevitably lead to questions about how those two realms could even interact causally, right? Like if they're so different, how can one affect the other?
You're hitting on a really crucial point. That's exactly where things get tricky. And there's been a lot of debate about whether Descartes himself was an occasionalist. I mean, a lot of the big names who came after him, within that Cartesian school of thought, they were definitely occasionalists.
Right.
So it's tempting to see him as the origin point. Some scholars say that, yeah, he might not have been a full-blown global occasionalist, but he did hold occasionalist views about bodies, extended substances. He might have denied that bodies could act on each other or on minds with any real causal power.
Okay.
Others disagree, though, and they point to passages where he seems to say that bodies do have genuine causal powers,
Yeah.
at least when it comes to body-body interactions.
So it's not so clear-cut.
Not at all. It's a real interpretive puzzle.
Yeah.
Because Descartes had this whole framework of different kinds of causation, body-body, body-mind, mind-body, and even mental causation.
Right.
And it's hard to pin down exactly where he stood on each one. But the areas that have caused the most debate are those body-body and body-mind interactions. I mean, the very idea of these two fundamentally different things, mind and body, causally interacting, it raised huge philosophical problems.
Yeah, like how can something immaterial, a mind, have any effect on something material, a body, and vice versa?
Exactly. And Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, she was a sharp thinker. She really pressed Descartes on this point. She wanted to know how this could even be possible. And his answers weren't always totally satisfying.
It seems like that inherent difficulty in explaining how mind and body could causally interact would naturally lead to something like occasionalism.
It totally makes sense as a response to that problem, although, as we've seen, the intellectual roots of occasionalism go back even further.
Right.
But yeah, the Cartesian framework definitely provided fertile ground for it to flourish.
Okay, so while Descartes' own position might be up for debate, who are the undisputed Cartesian occasionalists? The ones who are clearly and definitively committed to this view.
All right, so the main figures in this group are Louis de Laforge, Giraud de Cordemoy, Johannes Kloberg, and Arnold Gillenx.
Okay, 4 big names,
Right.
and each one contributed in their own way to the development of occasionalism.
Absolutely. Each one had their own spin on it, their own arguments and nuances.
So let's take them one by one. What were their main contributions? Let's start with Louis de Laforge. What did he bring to the table?
Well, first off, Laforge is actually the guy who some historians credit with using the term occasional cause for the first time.
Ah, so he coined the phrase.
Maybe, maybe not, but he
Yeah.
definitely used it in a way that stuck. And he argued that bodies are just remote and occasional causes of our ideas.
Okay.
Now, there's some debate about whether he extended this occasionalism to minds as well, but most scholars think he mainly focused on extended substances, bodies.
Got it.
He thought that our ideas, our thoughts, they don't need any external cause besides our own minds. They can kind of arise on their own.
Interesting. So for Laforge, it sounds like minds might have some genuine causal power, at least when it comes to ideas, but bodies are just these triggers or prompts for God to create ideas in us.
You got it. That's a great way to put it.
Cool. And what else? Did Laforge have any other big ideas?
Yeah, he also linked his occasionalism to the idea of God's continuous conservation of extended substances.
Okay, what does that mean?
He emphasized that God doesn't just, create a body and then leave it be.
Mm-hmm.
God has to continuously produce that body to keep it existing, and God also has to actively place it in a specific location.
So God's involved in not just the being of a body, but also its where.
Exactly. And this idea, it actually anticipates Malebranche's later argument that conservation is continuous creation. but we'll get to that later.
Okay, sounds good. So that's Laforge. What about Giraud de Cordemoy? What was his special contribution?
Okay, so Cordemoy is generally thought to have been a global occasionalist, meaning he denied genuine causal power to both minds and bodies. And Malebranche himself said that Cordemoy had a big influence on his thinking.
Wow, okay. So Cordemoy was a big deal. What was his main argument?
Well, he had this really interesting argument about motion. He said that for a body to keep moving, the same force that started it moving has to keep acting on it.
Okay.
And since bodies can't, like, self-initiate movement, he thought they must be set in motion by something non-material. And what's more non-material than God,
Yeah.
right? So for Cordemoy, God is the ultimate cause of all motion in the universe.
Yeah.
Any change in a body's motion, it's all God, all the time.
That's pretty wild. It's not just that bodies are passive, it's that they need this constant divine push to even move at all.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical view. Now, moving on to Johannes Kloberg.
Kuhlberg, okay. What did he focus on?
Well, he was really into the mind-body problem, and he argued for occasionalism, specifically when it came to how those two interact.
Okay.
He thought that because minds and bodies are so fundamentally different, they can't directly cause changes in each other.
Makes sense.
But the interesting thing is, most scholars think he didn't apply this occasionalism to body causation. He thought material objects could actually cause changes in each other.
So occasionalism just for the mind-body interaction.
Pretty much. And even that was nuanced. Some people think he mostly focused on how bodies cause sensations in minds, like how a pinprick causes pain. But even there, Kloberg might have thought that the soul itself plays a role in experiencing those sensations, rather than God directly causing them. So it's not quite the same as the full-blown God causes everything kind of occasionalism.
So Kloberg was kind of dipping his toes into the waters of occasionalism, but maybe not fully diving in.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He was definitely wrestling with the implications of Descartes' dualism and trying to find a way to make sense of it all.
Okay, so that leaves Arnold Gillinks. What was his big idea?
Gillinks had this really interesting principle, a causal principle, based on an epistemic limitation. Basically, he said that you can't bring about something unless you know how you're bringing it about.
Okay.
Like, you can't be the cause of something if you don't understand the mechanism behind it.
So if I don't know how my brain sends signals to my muscles to make my arm move, I can't be the true cause of my arm moving. That seems pretty strict.
It does, right. And that's one of the criticisms that people have raised against this argument.
Yeah, I can see why.
But the really fascinating thing about Gillinks is that he didn't just apply this principle to people, to rational agents. He thought it applied to everything, even inanimate objects.
Whoa, okay. So even a billiard ball can't cause another one to move unless it somehow, knows how it's doing it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which, has led to a lot of debate about how plausible that really is. And Malebranche actually took up a version of this no-knowledge argument later on, so we'll come back to that. But Gillinks definitely added a unique twist to the occasionalist perspective.
He definitely did. All right, so we've covered Laforge, Cordemoy, Kloberg, and Gillinks. They all had their own takes on occasionalism, but now we have to talk about the big one, right? Nicolas Malebranche.
Ah, Malebranche. He's the undisputed heavyweight champion of occasionalism.
For sure. He went all in on this view, didn't he?
Absolutely. He embraced it early on, laid out its core principles in his most famous work, The Search for Truth. And he spent a lot of time and energy defending it against all sorts of objections, like in his elucidations and his dialogues on metaphysics and religion.
Sounds like he was really dedicated to this idea.
He was, and for good reason. His arguments are generally considered the most thorough, systematic, and influential in the whole occasionalist tradition.
Okay, so Malebranche is definitely someone we need to understand if we want to understand occasionalism.
No doubt about it. Now, there's one more figure we should talk about, even though his connection to occasionalism is a bit more complex. George Berkeley.
Berkeley. Right, the idealist philosopher.
Yeah.
But how does he fit into all this? He's mostly known for his idea that physical objects are just collections of ideas, right?
Exactly. And that's precisely where the connection to occasionalism comes in.
I see.
Berkeley argued that ideas, by their very nature, are passive. They're what we perceive, not what does the perceiving. They can't actively cause anything.
Right.
And he famously said that no power or activity is perceived in physical objects. So if physical objects are just bundles of ideas, they can't have any real causal power, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. If they're just passive data in our minds, they can't be making things happen.
Exactly. Now, in his work De Motu, Berkeley actually gives another argument for the passivity of bodies, one that doesn't depend entirely on his idealism.
Okay.
He pointed out that even the Cartesians, they agreed that God is the ultimate source of motion in the universe. And even Newton himself suggested that the whole structure of the cosmos is ultimately sustained and moved by God's power.
Right.
So Berkeley argued, well, if bodies are fundamentally passive, then the cause of their existence must also be the cause of their motion and rest. And for Berkeley, that cause was, of course, God.
So it's kind of like the conservation is continuous creation argument. God's not just keeping things in existence, he's actively determining how they move and change.
Right on. Now, this raises a really interesting question. When we see one physical object seemingly acting on another, like a stove making water boil, what's really going on, according to Berkeley?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear his take on that.
Well, he'd say that it's actually God who's directly causing the sensations in our minds, the sensations that make us perceive the water boiling. And God does this in a really regular, predictable way, which is why we experience these consistent patterns we call the laws of nature. But behind it all, it's God orchestrating the whole show.
So it's not that the stove itself is making the water boil. It's God causing those sensations in us in response to the presence of the stove and the water.
You got it. Now, there's some debate about whether Berkeley thought this applied to our own bodies as well. Like, are our bodily movements also directly caused by God?
I see. That's a tricky one.
It is. Some scholars say yes, even our bodies are just these, like puppets moved by God. Others say no. Berkeley probably thought we have some genuine control over our own actions. It's not entirely clear.
Okay, so that's Berkeley's take on physical objects. But what about minds? Does he relegate them to the realm of mere occasions too?
Nope, that's where Berkeley makes a big distinction. He says that spirits, both finite minds like ours and the infinite divine mind, are genuinely causally active. They can actually do things.
Interesting. So he accepts occasionalism for the physical world, but not for the mental world?
Exactly. He wants to preserve some real agency for spirits. But, this does raise some potential problems for his system.
Oh, like what?
Well, if God is continuously creating everything, including the states of finite minds, how can those minds also be genuinely causally active?
Right. It seems like there's a potential conflict there. If God's doing everything, how can we be doing anything at all?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And it points to some of the complexities and tensions within Berkeley's philosophy. But that's a whole other deep dive.
Totally agree. All right, so we've got a good handle now on what occasionalism is and how it developed historically. But let's zoom out a bit and see how it fits into the bigger picture of philosophical thought.
Okay, sounds good. What are we zooming out to?
Well, we touched on this earlier, but I'm thinking about other philosophical responses to the mind-body problem.
Right.
Like Cartesian interactionism, where mind and body directly affect each other, and Leibniz's pre-established harmony, where they don't interact but just run in sync. How does occasionalism compare to those?
Great question. So all three of these views, they're trying to grapple with this puzzle. How can mind and body, which seem so fundamentally different, actually interact causally?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Now, interactionism, that's the most straightforward, right? Mind affects body, body affects mind, no problem.
Right.
But a lot of philosophers found that view problematic. I mean, how can something immaterial cause changes in something material, and vice versa?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how that would even work.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of whether this kind of interaction fits with the idea of a causally closed material universe, which was becoming more popular in science.
Right.
So both occasionalism and Leibniz's pre-established harmony, they were trying to get around this problem of direct interaction between mind and body.
Okay, so they both deny that mind and body can directly cause changes in each other.
Exactly. But they differ in a really important way.
Mm.
Leibniz, with his pre-established harmony, he still thinks that individual substances are causally active internally.
What does that mean?
It means each substance can cause changes in its own states. So a mind can cause changes in its own thoughts, and a body can cause changes in its own movements.
Okay.
But there's no crosstalk, no mind causing changes in a body, or vice versa. Instead, God sets everything up at the beginning so that all these individual substances run in perfect sync, like two clocks set to the same time.
Interesting. So they look like they're interacting, but they're really just running their own programs.
Exactly. It's a pretty clever solution.
It is. So where does occasionalism fit in?
Well, occasionalism goes even further. It says that creatures don't have any causal power at all, not even internally. So for an occasionalist like Malebranche, even when I think a thought or will to move my arm, I'm not actually causing those things to happen.
Whoa, okay.
It's God who's directly causing them, using my thoughts or volitions as you guessed it, the occasion.
So even our own internal thoughts and actions are ultimately just God acting through us.
That's the gist of it. Pretty
Yeah.
radical, right?
It definitely is. So it's like Leibniz allows for some creaturely agency, but occasionalism takes it all away and gives it all to God.
Right. It's a much stronger denial of creaturely power.
Yeah.
Now, another helpful way to understand occasionalism is to compare it to other views about how God's causality relates to natural causality. Theologians call this the problem of divine action.
Okay, so it's not just about mind and body, it's about how God's actions fit into the whole picture of the natural world.
You got it. So, besides occasionalism, the big players in this debate are conservationism and concurrentism.
Okay.
Conservationism is like the hands-off approach. It
Hmm.
says that God creates and sustains things in existence, but then creatures are pretty much on their own.
So God's like the watchmaker who builds the watch, winds it up, and then lets it run.
A perfect analogy. God provides the being and the powers, but the creatures are the ones actually using those powers to cause things. God's role is more about keeping things going, not about getting involved in the nitty-gritty details.
Got it. And what about concurrentism?
Concurrentism is kind of the middle ground. It says that God and creatures both directly cause the natural effects.
Okay, so it's more of a team effort.
Exactly. They work together, God's power and the creature's power, both contributing to the same effect. It's like they're co-authors of every event.
That's interesting. So you've got conservationism, where God steps back, concurrentism, where God and creatures collaborate, and then occasionalism, where God does everything.
You got it. Three very different ways of understanding how God acts in the world.
It's fascinating to see all these different perspectives.
It is. Okay, so we've got a good grasp of what occasionalism is, its history, and how it fits into the broader debates. Now let's dive into the arguments that occasionalists have used to support their view.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are their main lines of reasoning?
All right, there are a few key arguments that we need to unpack. And a lot of these were developed most fully by Malebranche, although, as we've seen, some of them have roots in earlier thinkers.
Okay.
So the first one we'll look at is often called the passive nature argument.
Passive nature. Okay. What's that all about?
Well, it's specifically focused on the nature of bodies, material objects. And it's a more local argument, meaning it's primarily aimed at showing that bodies can't be genuine causes without necessarily saying anything about minds or other kinds of substances.
Got it. So what's the gist of the argument?
Malebranche starts by asking us to think about something we see all the time, like one billiard ball hitting another and making it move.
Okay, pretty basic example.